afternoon. I'm Arianna Shirk. I'm a wife and a mom and a pediatrician in Kijabe, Kenya. And I'm actually here to tell you the story of how I tried to run away. How I tried to not be a pediatrician in Kijabe, Kenya, and how God insistently and consistently loved me and called me back to himself. I'm not a stranger to big moves for the sake of the gospel. When I was 1 year old, my dad left a career as a successful commercial real estate agent in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and he's going to kill me for that picture. And he moved to an apartment in Fort Wayne, Indiana, to create his life around a call that God gave him while he was driving down the highway past the seminary on the way home from a family reunion. My mom swore she would never marry a realtor and she would never marry a pastor, and she married them both. I grew up in this environment of big changes for the gospel, and my dad's first church was this tiny little church on top of a mountain with a white steeple with 60 people, surrounded by a peach orchard, and I learned to spit watermelon seeds, and one day I told my parents I wanted to be a medical missionary, and they were very confused. I was from a family of pastors and teachers. My sister at the same age said she wanted to be a duck, so we were very creative. But I was laser focused and possibly the most stubborn 5-year-old on the face of the planet. And I continued to walk in this call. I continued to study hard, to decide that this is what I was going to do. I didn't really know what it meant to be a 5-year-old, to be a doctor. I had no idea what that did. Even when I went to medical school, I didn't know you had to take exams for the rest of your life. But I focused, and I went through elementary school, and we moved to North Carolina, and when I got to high school, I realized that the world outside my cocoon was very broken, but that God met people in their brokenness, and he met people in their need, and I wanted to be a part of that. And as I went to college, I made up my major. I went through the book, and I circled every class I wanted to take and figured out how they related. And I'm the only person ever to graduate from Furman University with a Bachelor's of Science in Perspectives on Poverty and Health. But along the way, as I was learning things from my mentors and my teachers and my classes, I had a perfect plan in place that had been in place now for about 15 years. I knew exactly what God needed me to do, exactly where I was going, exactly what was happening, and he was bringing friends into my life that did things a little bit differently. One of them was a guy named David. David came from a really different background. His dad had committed suicide at the age of 10 under allegations of abuse, and he had found himself in the topsy-turvy world that happens when you're with a single mom with 3 young children that never expected to be there. But in that, he had taken God as his father, and he talked to God in this way that I had never seen before. I had the Sunday school answers, I had all of these things, but he talked to God and he expected him to answer. And he didn't have a plan because he knew that God's plan for him was way better than anything he was going to come up with. And he joked with me about running around the jungle with my coffee pot and said he didn't really think that was for him. But with his open-handedness, he went to Israel and to Greece and to Turkey and the Dominican Republic. And God started to work in his heart. And our senior year, when he asked me to marry him, this girl with the plan that included getting married next year, thought maybe, just maybe in this one instance, that God had a better plan for her than the one that she had been creating and carefully crafting for herself. And I went to medical school in North Carolina. And when I got there, implicitly and explicitly, they tell you that what you're studying, what you're learning, you need to learn hard, and you need to know it because someday it's going to be someone's mom or someone's kid or someone's dad or someone's brother sitting in front of you, and your ability to recall that knowledge, to apply it to the person in front of you is going to be the difference between them getting better or not, between them living or dying. And I took it to heart, and I studied long hours, and I had decided at some point that God wanted me to do obstetrics and gynecology. That is what I had decided, and I was very shocked when I got to obstetrics and gynecology, and it was not what I loved doing. But I was determined, and I still put my application in. And through some twists and turns that I am sure God had a hand in, I couldn't do my acting internship and what I thought I wanted to do with my life. And I thought, well, the people in pediatrics were pretty nice. I guess I'll do pediatrics, hematology, oncology for my rotation, and then I'll go on and do what I'm supposed to do with my life. And one morning, at 4 o'clock in the morning, I was walking in to the hospital, and I thought, I'm excited to see what my patients are doing. I'm excited to see what happened last night. I'm excited to walk with these families in one of the hardest things that they have ever walked in. And God whispered, he said, I thought I'd liked pediatrics because I had a newborn at home and that my teachers were teaching me how to take care of my kid. But that wasn't the case. He'd placed this love on my heart for children. So I thought I had this shocking news. And I called my husband and I said, I was thinking as I was driving into work today, what if I withdrew my application in OB and I submitted one in pediatrics? He goes, oh, thank goodness, you're happy when you do that. And I called my parents and I told them, I'm withdrawing my application. I'm going to submit in pediatrics. And they said, well, yeah, that's what makes sense. And I wondered, is anybody going to tell me? And I didn't look back. I applied for pediatrics and went to the University of Alabama at Birmingham to train, and I loved every second of it. I loved pulmonology, I loved hematology, I loved the ER, I loved ICU. I loved it every step of the way, and I was pretty good at it. And I found myself in my 3rd year facing a chief residency year. And people said, what are you doing? And I said, talked about overseas. I talked about I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready yet. I love my life here. I had another baby in residency. I had my 2 little girls and my 100-year-old house that we were fixing up and our church and our Sunday school kids that we loved teaching. And I said, well, where are we? And one day, literally, one of my attendings tossed me the intubating blade to intubate a patient, and I intubated the kid, and I was like, I can do this for the rest of my life. And so I applied in pediatric emergency medicine. At the time, I don't think I would have called it a stalling technique, but it was absolutely what it was. God had said go, and I said, not yet. And things changed. I got to fellowship, and instead of being part of a team where someone was in charge of me, I turned around to see who was going to tell me what to do, and no one was there. Hi. I'm taking this one off. I turned around as part of a team to see who was there, and it was me. I was in charge. And no one was there to tell me if the decision I made was right or wrong, if my knowledge was enough. And I was paralyzed. I went from confident, knowing exactly what I was doing, to wondering how in the world any parent would trust me to take care of their kid. Progressively, day after day, I started to dread my shifts, and I went from talking and joking and teaching to sitting in the corner and trying to get through my shift as quickly as humanly possible. And one day, I walked into the hospital, and I got to the revolving doors that I'd walked through for the previous 6 years, and I could not go in. And I sank onto the concrete, pretending to send a text on my phone, hoping no one was noticing exactly what was happening, and felt the cool glass against my door and felt the breath go out of me. And at that moment, one of my mentors, who had become an incredible friend, walked by, and she looked at me. She was always on her phone, and she said, "You okay?" I was like, "Nope." She just nudged her head in a direction, and I knew that meant my office in 5 minutes. And so I started walking. I didn't know what I was going to say. I knew I was late for my shift, and someone was expecting me to show up. This friend is one of the kindest, most southern women you will ever meet in your entire life. And I don't know what I expected her to say, but I knew she'd come up with something. And so when I sat down and dissolved into ugly, mascara-running sobs in her desk, I think I expected a hug. Instead, she set her jaw, and she looked at me with incredible compassion but determination, and she said, "Arianna, you are not that important." Excuse me. I didn't know I was saying I was important. She said, you need to trust your God more. He can do this without you, and he chooses to do this with you. He brings you those patients. He chooses you at that moment, at that time. I felt something crack in my heart that day. You see, for the last year and a half before that, I had not opened my Bible. I was terrified of what God was going to tell me to do if I did. I knew my joy was gone. I knew my purpose was gone. And so I went home that day and asked my husband, why are we doing this? Why did I miss my daughter's first steps? Why have I spent 80 hours at a hospital every single week for the last 7 years? And we went back to that little girl spitting watermelon seeds with a dream of medical missions. And we weren't sure what was next, but we sent an email to the only missionary that we knew in Africa, Eric Hansen, a pediatric surgeon in Kijabe, Kenya, that my husband, a photographer, had done support pictures for. And I said, do you need help? I don't know if I'm going to be help, but do you need help? Let me see. Let me see what God said and what I've been running from and see what he does. And so 3 months later, we were on a plane to Kijabe, Kenya, with my 3-year-old and my 5-year-old and my husband. And when I walked in, the 3 long-term pediatricians there had accidentally scheduled to all be out of cell phone range and the hospital for my first weekend in Africa. I was poured out and exhausted, and I was in charge. And that weekend still, and I've been in Africa for 3 years now, stands as the busiest and craziest and most ridiculous weekend of my entire life because God had a lot to teach me. And so I went from a patient seizing, and I stopped their seizing, and I went to a patient in ICU who was bleeding uncontrollably from a reason we didn't know. And I went to the ER where I'm sitting there, and I'm going, okay, they're not, okay, I gave them the medicine. I've got, the heart is working a little bit better now. They're not blue, they're pink. And then I turned around, and a baby walked in gray and barely breathing. And I stopped mid-sentence and turned to them, and I laid them down to start an IV, and the heart stopped. And I didn't get it back. And at that moment, the anesthesiologist who had come to help me intubate tapped me on the shoulder. He said, Daktari, you are needed in theater. There are 2 babies, 1 heart. Okay, please let me have lost something in translation there, but it was English, so it wasn't lost. And I walked to that theater yelling at God, how dare you? I am not able to do this. I cannot do this. I am not the right person. Why is there not someone stronger or smarter or able to do this more here? Why me? And I received those 2 precious baby boys, kicking, screaming, sticking their fingers in each other's mouths, and joined forever at the heart. I ushered them to the nursery and just sat and stared, and I looked up the odds on my phone. 1 in 10 million baby boys joined at the heart, born alive on my first weekend in Africa. And I wrote the pediatrician that had been there for 25 years because she was finally back in cell phone signal and said, Jennifer, what do I do? And she said, I don't know. I've never seen this before. And I hung up with her and I stared at these kids and I heard God's whisper. And he said, you are so right. You cannot do this. But I love you, and I love those baby boys, and I can. I went home and slept after that really long night, after a lot of tears and a lot of prayers and a lot of sick kids. And I woke up, and I walked out where my husband was sitting at the kitchen table with the sunset of the Great Rift Valley in the background. And he shook his head and started laughing. And he said, you want to come back? And I said, mm-hmm. And he said, good, me too. And that was it. That was our whole discussion about moving our children across the world. We had not come to Kijabe to move there, but God had created a home for us in this place. I applied to the Samaritan's Purse post-residency program from Kenya. I was within days of the deadline. They bent the rules for me, 2 30-page applications, 8 letters of recommendation, and I got on a plane and drove to Boone for my interview. I was incoherent. I was jet lagged. My husband and I didn't realize we were supposed to interview together, so that went really well. And they asked us really hard questions and really wise ones of people that have been doing medicine in Africa and all over the world for a long time, and we didn't have the answers. And we walked away, and I've had good interviews in my life. That was not one of them. And I didn't know what God was saying, but I thought he was saying not now, but I wanted it to be now. Because I'd started to feel alive, and the medicine that I'd known I was supposed to do my entire life. So I almost drove off the road 3 weeks later when they called to tell me I was accepted into the program. So our hearts toward Kenya, we began the long process of selling everything we owned. Our couches, the girls' toys, the clothes that I couldn't wear there that I wore in Birmingham, memories that we were boxing up. And I was going through scrapbooks with my mom, and she stopped at a page and she gasped. I was like, Mom, what's going on? We're just going through scrapbooks. We got to figure out what goes in the box and what goes. She goes, Ari, what date are you landing in Kenya? September 24th. Why? And she pushed the letter towards me. I'd written a letter when I was 7. It was supposed to be dated 20 years in the future. I was off by fellowship and residency. I didn't know those things existed as a 7-year-old. And it says, I got a new job today. I'm off to Africa. I figure it's best. Love you, Arianna. And the date in the top corner, September 24th. In all of the storms and all of the craziness that had surrounded us, God's whisper that this entire time where I tried to run and tried to change it and tried to move it around, that he was in all of that, right down to the day we landed. And so on September 24th, 2014, I wasn't that close, I walked off a plane in Kenya with my family to the rest of our life. And that detour, my pediatric emergency medicine fellowship, they'd already started a process to start the first fellowship for pediatric emergency medicine and critical care at the University of Nairobi, the first one in East Africa when I got off that plane. And he had put in place mentors and a school for my kids and a job for my husband where he does amazing things every day. And a life that he knew was better than the one that I had planned for myself. So there's a story in 1 Kings 19 of Elijah standing on a mountain, and God tells him to go to the mountain. So he goes to the mountain, and then there's a storm that rips the rocks apart. And then there's wind out of nowhere, and then there's a fire. And God had said, I'm going up there, but Elijah didn't step out in the storm or the fire or the wind or the rocks. And then there was a quiet whisper. And Elijah covered his head and stepped out. And God looked at him. He said, what are you doing? Hi. That's what he said. I looked it up again today to make sure I'm telling you the truth. And I feel like that's what God asks me every single day. I love our life. It is hard, and it is beautiful, and it is heartbreaking. But I feel like every day when I wake up, God meets me and says, what are you doing here? Because he has called us to bind up the brokenhearted and to see the lame walk and the deaf hear and the blind see. He has called us to lay down our lives for the sake of the gospel and for his glory. So I don't know what your story is. It's going to be different than mine, and if you run from it, I hope he pulls you back to it, because it's one of the most amazing things that can happen in this world. Thank you.